Okay, so tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in the disability community.
Okay, so my name is Anat Caspi. I'm the director of the Tasker Center for Accessible Technology, and I am a bioengineer by trade. So I was educated in machine learning and AI methods, and then I worked in the medical instrumentation industry for 12 years before returning back to academia. And a lot of my concern around disability has really been in ableism in engineering and machine learning. Having worked as an engineer in industry, I identified a lot of um, both intentional and unintentional ableist methods in the way that we do design, research, and development in industry. And so I wanted to be able to work on that exclusively as opposed to just as a byproduct of working on specific projects in industry. And I had the opportunity to found the Tasker Center, which is focused on the development and translation of research products into real artifacts in the hands of real people with a focus on engineering technical artifacts for people with disabilities.
That's cool. So, my next question is, how has accessibility been for people with disabilities, historically?
You mean in one word, like horrible?
Like just like a general sense, like in terms of accessibility and like moving around and like because people with wheelchair users, and myself included, often face barriers with like getting around or just completing certain tasks. So in that sense, how what would you say?
Yeah, so I look a lot at accessibility as a mismatch in the what people, users bring to the fore and what designers and engineers had done to create either an environment, the built environment, or an artifact, or some kind of tool or something of that nature. So when people are excluded from the initial thinking in the design process, that often creates a mismatch between who can use whatever was created and what affordances that creation allows. And to me, that sums up inaccessibility in a multitude of ways. It's not really just about ability. It can also be cultural inaccessibility, language inaccessibility, mismatch in terms of like social expectations and, what these technology artifacts are intended to bring to people's lives and the actual lives that people bring to the fore as a user. And so a lot of times, we can think about access in a number of different ways. I'm not trying to gloss over access as a specific concern for people with disability because that often is like a major concern that comes up. But at the same time, I think as we educate designers, as we educate engineers, we want to give them the sense that um, their artifacts matter, but also the design process really matters, and who they think of as their user will have a huge impact on the outcome that they have. And so this is something that I think is really important to express to young engineers and young designers in order to improve access and accessibility of the artifacts that we build downstream from here.
hmm Yeah, my next question is, you're also the executive director of TCAT, or the task, the Center for Accessible Technology. Is that different to what what you currently do in terms of like building accessible spaces, or is that kind of along those same lines? Like,
Yeah, so we focus on 3 pillars. One is to look at access to transportation and personal mobility. So we have a number of different projects that focus on both accessibility to digital artifacts and information about transit and transportation spaces and pedestrian spaces, for example. But we also have hardware type of projects like autonomous wheelchair, where we try to enhance the features of a power wheelchair with a kit that's designed to understand a little bit about the context of the environment that someone is traveling in, and trying to have that negotiation with the user in terms of like, oh, okay, you've had a lot of sun exposure today. What do you want to do? Things of that nature that allow the users of wheelchairs to be to kind of let down their guards when they have to be aware of so many things that are contextualized. Allowing technology to enhance some of the features of the power chair. The second pillar that we work on is ableism in AI and machine learning. We try to look and do a lot of data set audits to understand, is there sufficient representation of data about people with disabilities in large data sets, so that, for example, when autonomous vehicles are being trained, computer vision algorithms are being trained on these large data sets for driving, is there enough representation of people with wheelchairs, people with canes, so that the computer vision algorithms would be able to identify them when they see them in the wild, right? So to me, it's really important to identify those sources of some of the ableist concerns that these machine learning and AI implementations come in. And the third pillar for us is contextually aware environments, and that also involves robotics. So I mentioned the autonomous wheelchair that kind of bridges between the personal mobility pillar and the contextually aware environments. But we also work on robotic feeding instruments and other types of machine learning instrumentation that enables the environment to understand who is here, what are their intentions, how can the environment conform to what the person wants, as opposed to forcing people to oftentimes, when you come to a new environment, you're asked to change your position, sit in specific chairs, align yourself with specific kind of seating arrangement. And so in this instance, we're trying to rethink of how environments can accommodate humans as opposed to humans accommodating the environments.
mm-hmm. My next question is, what kind of impact, sorry, I keep looking down, I'm looking at my notes here. What impact does, this kind of work have on the disability community in terms of like making things, accessible for people with disabilities, whether that is building ramps or building devices that would help a person with limited mobility, eat, bathe, I guess. What kind of impact do those things have on the greater, not just on the individuals with disabilities themselves, but the greater community?
So with the help of Disability Rights Washington and Front and Centered, we just successfully lobbied the Washington State Legislature to spend $10 million in the next 5 years towards collecting all the sidewalk data for all of Washington State, where the technology that the Tasker Center has developed will be used to do that collection that has a huge implication to all Washington state residents, but really focuses on people with disabilities, because people experiencing the biggest informational gaps about the pedestrian environment are people who have concerns about, what am I going to find when I come there? Is there going to be a ramp? Am I going to go up a hill that's too steep for me to climb? Is the width of the sidewalk everywhere you're going to be sufficient for my chair to pass? You know, those types of questions are questions that people with disabilities ask, but it brings greater good to the entire community, because we can then route everybody to the bus system with ease. You know, if we know what the sidewalks contain and where there is and is not infrastructure, we can more sustainably lead our community members to using public transit, ditching their private cars, um, be able to assess where there isn't a path for them to do that. And so force legislatures to then spend their money and resources appropriately to enhance accessibility in neighborhoods where accessibility is lacking. Right now, there's really very little appropriate prioritization schemas, because if we don't know what the infrastructure is, people just make decisions about where to spend project money in somewhat arbitrary ways. They're not totally arbitrary, but they're not based on actual data-driven methods to say, oh, hey, look, you know, this neighborhood is cut off from this neighborhood. The only way you can connect them is by investing in these sidewalk projects that will connect those two neighborhoods. If you don't have the data to be able to demonstrate that, it's very hard to you know, allocate the resources that you do have. And of course, we can't remediate everything everywhere. You know, that will take billions of dollars in Washington state. So you have to be able to have enough information to allow you to prioritize where to put your resources. And this kind of data will allow us to do that.
Hmm. My last question is, what can we do at the state and federal level to create, accessible open spaces, where people can, where people can live, laugh, play, just how do we sort of, what steps do we need to do? What steps, what can be done at the state and federal level to like to make that happen, to make sure that people with disabilities and others, live in a accessible, safe space?
That's a very loaded question. I think you know, my starting point in the long game, not the short game. I think one of our problems is that our elected officials often have very short time horizons, so it's hard to play the long game when you're dealing with people who want to be reelected in 2 years, not 60 years, right? Um, so how do you, I guess one of the things we can do, both at the state and federal level, is be able to identify short, measurable, impactful mechanisms of change, like this data collection effort, which doesn't bring us the parks, doesn't bring us the accessible spaces, but at least it highlights like where these huge deficiencies are. And then the next stage is to then go lobby for the state and federal legislatures to say, okay, here are where all these gaps are. We need to remediate these communities because they've been um, disadvantaged wrong. We have to correct those wrongs. And so then the next short game is like, after you game those, you gain more smaller projects and resources based on the data and information that you're able to collect and showing impact, right? Like once you make these impactful projects, yes, you have to demonstrate how that has improved health outcomes for those communities, how that has improved, you know, both mental health as well as other kinds of life outcomes that we care about and tend to index. So I think, you know, in the disability community, we often are focused on the long game. And I think the best thing we can do is identify these short incremental steps to make them commensurate with a very short-sighted, myopic sometimes view that legislators have because they need to get reelected in the next 2 or 4 years.
Yeah, that's fair. That seems fair. That's a fair point.